Hey everyone, happy July 5th. And for those of you that download the show and aren't watching us live, little spoiler alert, we do record the show midweek. So, if July 5th is a little passe, whatever. But happy July 5th. Hope everybody had a July 4th. That is going to be something we're going to be talking about a little bit, even though this is a Bengals podcast. We're kind of in the dog days of summer. We're a couple of weeks away from training camp, and on the Orange and Black Insider, we've been talking a lot about current players, roster battles, what to look for in training camp. This episode of the Orange and Black Insider is going to be a little different, and we'll get to that in just a second. Thank you for those of you that are joining us live. We're on YouTube, and we are on Cincy Jungle as well, so you can catch the stream live there. And if you aren't able to join us live, as always, you can catch the show on iTunes, on SoundCloud, at Cincy Jungle. You can get in touch with the show on Twitter at BengalsOBI and via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. We are going to be taking some listener questions again, as we usually do at the end of the show. So send those in the YouTube chat. Send those in the Cincy Jungle comment thread, and we'll try and get to some of those. We've already got a couple of them queued up. So thank you for all of those that you've sent to us already, but keep them coming. We're gonna vet those. I am joined, as usual, by my co-host Scott Schultze. Scott, how was your fourth? You've got a little one of your own, and obviously this is a holiday that's a lot of fun, but also about hanging out with friends and family.
Yeah, it was pretty good. It's kind of different now that we are, I guess, technically adults by age. It's kind of nice. Because I look at it more, it's a day off work and, day to take the, kids to a parade or whatever. Although I think we're both old enough. One of my best memories, or one of, would be when I was younger and we, when you finally got old enough that you got to shoot fireworks off yourself and not just watch the adults shoot them off. But back when I was a kid, we still had these things called bottles that were made of glass. And not these cheapy plastic ones. And so you put bottle rockets actually in these glass bottles. And that was the whole point of a bottle rocket. I don't think you can do that anymore. I don't know if it'd melt the plastic, but yeah, I remember out on the street, setting glass bottles down and lighting bottle rockets, because that's why it's a bottle rocket.
We talked about this a little bit before we took the air here, Scott. Where I live is they clamp down a little harder on recreational fireworks usage from non-professionals. Usually all the shows and everything that go on are done by communities, cities, that sort of thing. So, I didn't really get to fire any off, and not, there's still some people that smuggle some contraband and do their own deal. But is it a little different from where you live, where people can kind of do their own deal in that regard?
Yeah, it varies from town to town. And for those who don't know, I'm in Ohio. I know for a long time they were illegal to buy. Some were. The bigger ones were. So what you would do is you would just go across the state lines. And if you went on like I-70 into Indiana or into some of the air states, as soon as you cross the border, you'd have these really large warehouses that would say, big billboard, fireworks. Because that's what you would do. You would just drive across the state line. You'd buy these big, massive, fireworks, and then you turn around and come back to Ohio. And I think since then the laws have changed a little, because they realized, hey, they're still going to get them, and we're not getting the tax revenue from it. Kind of like they did in Cincinnati with the riverboat casinos, where they said no, and then they just park them across the river in Newport, and then Kentucky gets all the revenues. But yeah, it's a little more lax. It varies from community to community as far as what you can or can't do. But for the most part, the area where I'm at, it's very common. A few days before and after the 4th, you hear, people just shooting off fireworks in their backyard, just kind of having fun with them at night. And I know, and you go in the country, and some people will get much more rowdy because they have big fields, and they'll just shoot off really large displays, and people get lawn chairs, and just kind of chill out and watch the fireworks. And then you go see the real ones, in your town if you want to. But yeah, it very different than California, it sounds like.
A little bit. What we're gonna do it's a little slow on the news front in terms of the Bengals right now. We are going to get to a lot of Bengals stuff, obviously, but just real quick before we do, Scott and I are going to talk a little bit about our July 4th rituals and some of our preferred culinary items and all of that. And we want to hear from you, the live folks that are watching, about not only what you did for July 4th, but what are some of your habits? What are the ways that you like to celebrate? We do have some folks that listen to the podcast across the pond in the UK and whatnot. So maybe they don't celebrate Independence Day as we do here, obviously in America, but it is a major holiday here. And, a lot of our listeners are here in America and celebrate Independence Day. So Scott, real quick, recap what you did with your family on the 4th, and what are some of your favorite food items, your favorite places to go on July 4th? What do you like to do, as a family, as a guy growing up, in middle America? What are some of the things that you kind of cherish about the holiday and that you continue to do as maybe a tradition?
I guess the stereotypical thing, for those who don't live in California, what people do generally in Ohio, and I'm sure it's not just in Ohio, but maybe middle America, Midwest, is the typical, you have the day off. Some communities have a little parade. You might go see that. You have a cookout at someone's house, beer and brats and, burgers and all the B food groups. And then you might shoot off some fireworks in the backyard, and then you go, to your local town or city wherever you live and watch the really big one. So growing up, we've always done some sort of variant of that. Maybe not in that order, and maybe, different pieces of it, different years. So I'd say that really isn't any different. None of them really stands out as a big, they were all, kind of cool, seeing fireworks and lighting them and launching them. And, when you're a kid, it's kind of hard not to like blowing stuff up. So that's always pretty cool. And as far as we've kind of covered favorite food before, and I'm still a sucker for like Blizzards and Culver's and Dairy Queen. So if anyone who works at one of those places is listening and you want, free advertising, feel free to send me some free coupons, and I'll be happy to sit here eating my concrete mixer, my cold stuff, whatever during the podcast, and give you some free advertising. But anyway, that stuff's good every day of the year, not just July 4th.
Shameless plug alert, by the way.
So I would say that stuff still applies on July 4th.
Yeah. And what's funny, Scott, it's just a little side note. My brother, who's also a Bengals fan, and he reads Cincy Jungle, and he actually tunes into this podcast from time to time, and he actually mentioned that, he asked a little bit about how you and I know each other and interact, and obviously it's through the Cincy Jungle site and this show and whatnot. And he's like, oh, yeah, Scott, he's the guy who likes the Blizzards, right? So that's your reputation with a relative of mine, my brother, out here in Southern California. So you're the Blizzard guy, my friend. For me, I've kind of started a little bit of a recent tradition. Again, talking about my brother, he's got 4 kids of his own, and we live 5-10 minutes away from a beach here in Southern California. So the last couple of years, we go down to the beach, even though it's like the worst day to go to the beach in terms of crowds and the types of people you get there, but still a ton of fun. Hot, and it's a great day to get in the water, do some surfing, do some body surfing, all that kind of stuff. So we do that. There's also usually a sandcastle contest, so his kids get into it. As some of you might know, I have a 4-month-old now, and it was basically his first time down at the beach, and so we got to take him down there, and that's one of our traditions. What happens in the evening's a little different. Sometimes it's a barbecue, sometimes it's hanging out with family, hanging out with friends, just kind of depends. But always some good adult beverages are in the mix, as is sun, and an unfortunate tradition of mine, because I'm a relatively fair-skinned guy, and even though I get a lot of sun here in Southern California, sunburns are an unfortunate tradition of mine in July 4th. But still a great day, great time with family and friends. You and I both have little ones, so it's pretty cool now that we get to kind of maybe change a little bit of the traditions because of that. But we want to hear from you. Even though this is a Bengals podcast, we're still celebrating America one day later, and we want to hear your favorite drinks, activities, what you do with family and friends. If you don't live by a beach, do you go by a lake and go on a quote-unquote beach there and hang out? We want to hear from you. Just let us know through the show on the YouTube chat, the Cincy Jungle chat. We're monitoring that. We do want to hear from you and see how you spent your 4th of July. Greg L. already in the YouTube chat says basically beer, pools / beaches, barbecue, and fireworks. I mean, that's about as all-American as you can get. And I think a lot of people do that. Obviously, there's, you know, all kinds of stuff that people do when they go to the beach, the pool, paddleball and beach volleyball and all that fun stuff. But we all hope you had a safe and fun 4th of July, no matter how you spent it. Again, we'll be monitoring. So let us know, you know, kind of how you spent your 4th and what you usually like to do, because we are interested in what our listeners like to do and what our fellow Bengals fans do. Hey, if it is Bengals related somehow that you spent your 4th of July, let us know, because Scott and I would really like to maybe integrate some Bengals type of activity in our July 4th celebrations, I'm sure. Again, this show, you can download the show on SoundCloud, on iTunes. We're on YouTube, and you can get our material on Cincy Jungle. You can get in touch with the show at Bengals OBI on YouTube, on Twitter, excuse me, and via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. We are taking listener questions, so submit those in the YouTube chat and to our YouTube or Cincy Jungle comment stream. We're going to be looking at those. We want to hear from you. Scott, I think what we're going to spend the bulk of today talking about is you and I are both history buffs, both in terms of academics and just general interests. So we're going to talk a little history, but it's going to be Bengals-related history. And I got to give a tip of the cap to Jim Ozarski of the Cincinnati Enquirer. And not only because, you know, he's a media member of the local Cincinnati media that gets a lot of access to quotes and interviews and all that sort of thing that not everybody is privy to. So, you know, we lean on him for that. But, you know, again, not a ton of, you know, training camp news at this point because we're a couple of weeks away. Jim Ozarski has come out with a very interesting series, and it basically ties into the Bengals' 50th anniversary as a franchise, and I found it very interesting. And it centers around the whole Paul Brown, Bill Walsh, Sam Wyche, Mike Brown, the whole type of thing, and obviously the direction that both the 49ers and the Bengals went as franchises in the mid to late 70s and on, especially throughout the 80s when Walsh was the coach at San Francisco. For those who don't know, I mean, Scott, I guess we could give a little history lesson. You and I, when all of this stuff happened with Bill Walsh, you know, the Super Bowls and things of that nature, I was around for them. I wasn't around in terms of when Walsh was with the Bengals and all of that. But for those who don't know, maybe you're on the younger end of the Bengals fan spectrum, that sort of thing. Bill Walsh was actually an offensive assistant with the Cincinnati Bengals, and essentially was passed up for a job that he thought was his in terms of a head coach in the mid-70s for a guy that Paul Brown favored, and Bill Tiger Johnson. And Bill Johnson was one of those loyal Paul Brown guys, and I think a lot of people in that building, when it came time for the team to make a coaching change, I believe it was when Paul Brown stepped down as the head coach himself of the Bengals, a lot of people, including players, thought that it was going to be Bill Walsh's job to have, and it wasn't. And there's a lot of different things from that point, that period, I believe it was in 1976, that created a very interesting time in football. And Scott, what we're going to do is we're going to create a number of hypothetical questions based on if the Bengals went with Bill Walsh, what would have happened, you know, all of that kind of stuff. But you had some interesting things to say, I guess, to kick off this segment on Bill Tiger Johnson and maybe the parallels with his, I think he was with the team for about 3.5 seasons, and Bill Walsh's. Now, I know and doing a little bit of research myself on Bill Tiger Johnson, he was 18-15 with the Bengals and never made a postseason appearance, or never led them to a postseason appearance. He did have a 10-4 record on his resume, but other than that, largely unimpressive, I guess. He resigned after the team started 0-5 in his final season, and the team went, I believe it was with Forrest Gregg after that. So I'm kind of rambling a little bit. I want to get your thoughts, at least to start this segment off, Scott, with that initial decision from Paul Brown to go with Bill Johnson and Bill Walsh, because you had mentioned those two teams, the 49ers and the Bengals, kind of had some early parallels, at least in terms of performance.
Now, I will start this off by saying you had me very excited at the beginning of this segment because we were just talking about 4th of July. You mentioned history, how we're both history buffs. I'm like, oh, okay, now we're going to dive into, the deeper American revolutionary stuff, how the war really wasn't about taxes, about representation, and we're really going to get into this whole, the Federalist Papers and, yeah. Anyway.
You're speaking my language, my friend. You're speaking my language. I get you. We're geeking out today. I get it. I get it.
That being said, we have a different history lesson, probably more relevant, which would be the Cincinnati Bengals. So in that regard, yeah, that was one thing I was kind of looking at just to get a feel for the timeline of what happened and kind of the initial look back at how that played out. And obviously in hindsight, it's very easy to look back and say, oh my gosh, Bill Walsh was great. What kind of moron would not hire this guy? But it's very easy for us to look at, 20, 30 years later. But in the, time frame of when it happened and what happened right after, it's not as clear cut as we like to think it is today. And that's something I wanted to look at. So if you look at Bill Walsh's history at the Bengals, in 68 and 69 and 70. So for 3 years, he was a wide receiver coach. And then from 71 through 75, he was the quarterback coach. Mm-hmm. And obviously, they had Ken Anderson for several of those years. And Ken Anderson had a very good final year with the Bengals during that time. But he wasn't a coordinator. He wasn't an offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, had never had a head coaching job before then. So at that point, he was basically a positional coach, kind of like what the Bengals had with Vance Johnson years ago, where he wasn't a coordinator. He was just a position guy. He had some hype, some upside. Hey, this guy could be a head coach someday. But there was reasons why the Bengals probably wouldn't have made Vance Joseph the next head coach. Mm-hmm. So anyway, in 1975, the Bengals went 11-3, made the playoffs. That was Paul Brown's last year. Paul Brown retired. So in 76, they had to make a decision who to bring in or who to become the head coach. They could have made Bill Walsh the head coach. They chose not to. They went with Bill Johnson. And if you were around in 76 and you look at what happened, well, the team went 10-4, barely missed the playoffs, pretty much the same team that went 11-3 the year before. Right? Yeah, it was a good team. They had a good record. They seemed to do pretty well. It was probably the right decision. Walsh didn't have a lot of experience as far as being a head coach or the top guy. He ended up going, after that decision was made, he went to San Diego, became their offensive coordinator. So for 1 year, he was the coordinator for the Chargers. They had Dan Fouts in his prime, future Hall of Famer Charlie Joyner, and they struggled. They only went, I have it here somewhere. They finished 19th out of 28, or out of 28 teams in scoring. So just so after 76, you're thinking, wow, okay, clearly made the right decision. Walsh, couldn't cut it as a coordinator. Bill Johnson, almost got us back to the playoffs. Had a very good 10-4 season. We're on the, we're doing well. Walsh went to Stanford and became Stanford's head coach. Had pretty good, decent success. I mean, nothing phenomenal, not like an Alabama, Ohio State kind of, 12-0 kind of season, but they were 9-3, 8-4. They made the top 25 both years, won both their bowl games. So had solid seasons. And then after that, during that time, in 77 and 78, the Bengals had Bill Johnson again, 77. They went 8-6. So a slight step down. The next year started 0-5, and Bill Johnson stepped down or was whatever the technical term was, fired, let go, resign. He no longer coached.
Quote unquote resigned, right?
Exactly. And they brought in a guy named Homer Rice, who finished the year for them and went 4-7. Not great, but a lot better than 0-5. Interestingly, up until 1978, Homer Rice had coached a couple different places. I think he had coached at SMU and at University of Cincinnati. His career college coaching record was 12-28-1. So clearly wasn't a very good coach in college. Only 4-7 for the Bengals. If you were going to make a change after that season, probably would have been a pretty good year. No one would have faulted you for saying, hey, we brought Rice in for half the season. He finished up. He's not a good college coach, obviously not a good pro coach. Let's grab someone like Bill Walsh would have been available. Instead, the Bengals decided to give Rice a full year. They gave him a half year, and it was not absolutely atrocious. Let's give him a full year, see what he can do. Okay, the full year went pretty bad. He went 4-12, and that was his last year at the Bengals. But at the same time, the 49ers brought Bill Walsh in from Stanford, so just down the street, basically. And so they basically had missed their chance by keeping Rice. But in his first year, Walsh only went 2-14. So even if you're a Bengals fan in 1979, 3-4 years after Walsh was last with the Bengals, you're thinking, we really didn't lose anything from letting this guy go. Yeah, Rice was horrible, but Bill Walsh really didn't do anything either. He was bad as offensive coordinator. He's bad his first year as a head coach. Clearly, we made the right decision moving on from him. That's all good. The next year, 1980, the Bengals replaced Rice, brought in Forrest Gregg. He went 6-10. Bill Walsh also went 6-10. So even after 1980, you're thinking, okay, it's pretty even as a push. It really didn't matter one way or the other.
Yeah, if you're a Bengals fan, you're not really thinking about it. You're going, oh, okay, well, I mean, that guy who used to coach for the Bengals he's now a head coach elsewhere who's just kind of meh.
Yeah, he was decent in college, and granted, he was top 25, which is good, but, they didn't have 120 teams or whatever in D1 back then. So, you're thinking, okay, he left. And you probably forgot all about him by this point because he hasn't really done anything. Then comes 1981, which is the year everyone knows Bill Walsh from Cincinnati because that's the year they made the Super Bowl. But Forrest Gregg also made the Super Bowl. And granted, Walsh won. It was a very close game. Could have gone either way. And as a Bengal fan, after that year, you're probably thinking, okay, even though Walsh won, we were in it. We had a chance to win. Both teams are ascending, climbing. They have a good coach. We have a good coach. So I think, for his first 5 or 6 years, you're pretty much thinking there's nothing, letting Walsh go was not a horrible thing. Then you go, and even in 1982, it looked like a good decision because the Niners only went 2-7. The Bengals went 7-2 and made the playoffs. So now you're at, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81. So for 7 years, other than a super, super, super close Super Bowl, it looks like a better decision that the Bengals went with not having Walsh as the head coach. And then, of course, everything changes after that. From 83 on, Walsh went 68-26, multiple Super Bowls, 10-win seasons every year.
Yeah.
Greg.
So let's I don't want to cut you off, but let's stop there because that's kind of where we're going to start to turn the conversation and then ask some of these hypotheticals. So obviously, first of all, great recap of the history there for those listeners who do not really know of Bill Walsh. They just kind of know Bill Walsh, the guy that coached the Niners in the 80s and had 4 Super Bowl wins and was one of the best coaches ever, and obviously had Montana and Rice. So, but I just wanted to stop you just because there are a couple of parallels that I want to add in here in terms of Walsh, the Bengals, and then Walsh and the 49ers. Now, Walsh, when you mentioned that he was the quarterbacks coach of the Bengals in the, I believe it was early 70s, Sam Wyche was a quarterback on the Bengals roster. And Sam Wyche was a guy that was coached by Bill Walsh. And after their playing careers, if I'm not mistaken, after Sam Wyche's playing career, I believe kind of a general assistant coach on the offense to the Bengals at that point. I could be wrong on that. But in general, there's that connection there between Sam Wyche, the quarterback who was coached by Walsh, and then obviously there's the connection now with Walsh to the 49ers. And in his first year, I believe it was 1979, with the 49ers, he drafted Joe Montana. Now, Joe Montana was a guy that was undervalued in terms of draft stock. He won a lot of games at Notre Dame, very productive guy, but they thought he was too slight, maybe a little bit too small, not a strong enough arm. And now we're talking about him as potentially the best quarterback, if not the best quarterback. Potentially the best quarterback, or one of the top 3 best quarterbacks in the NFL. So now, as you chronicled through the Tiger Johnson, Homer Rice, Forrest Gregg years, that to me, what you just pointed out with the stats and the records and all that, that's very interesting to me. But where the story gets really interesting, Scott, is, and I'm sure you have more to say on this, and I want to hear it, is when Wyche took over as the Bengals head coach, and obviously Walsh is still in San Francisco at that point. Kind of recap that for us a little bit. And obviously one thing I want to throw out is you look at Sam Wyche's coaching record with the Bengals. I believe he was 61-66. And you look at Bill Walsh as the San Francisco 49ers head coach. At least I believe its regular season record is 92-59-1 with those 3 Super Bowl championships. So obviously you then look at that period and you go, okay, that's where the disparity happens, right?
Yeah, I think obviously it's very hard to look at that, that era after Walsh kind of had his great run and say, man, it'd be wonderful to have him there. And that is where the big separation comes. And obviously as a Bengals fan, in retrospect, you would love to have Walsh during that period because of everything he did. And I'm sure since you kind of talk about how certain people in Cincinnati thought Walsh was going to be the head coach, they clearly saw some of that in Cincinnati. The interesting thing is because it took him all those 5 or 6 years to have that run of success, would the Bengals have stuck with him that long? And I know obviously Mike Brown sticks to Marvin Lewis forever, but it is very interesting to ponder, would Mike Brown have stuck with Walsh? Someone who it's kind of there's reports they kind of butted heads and didn't really see eye to eye all the time, despite the fact they had a working relationship and had success. Would he have stuck with him for 5 or 6 years during that period where he was basically honing his craft, becoming a head coach, kind of getting his feet wet at Stanford, and it's interesting thing, this guy was an amazing coach, had amazing offense, but yet when he had these, 2 great Hall of Fame caliber players in San Diego, couldn't do anything. And so it kind of makes you feel, okay, it probably took him a few years to figure out what he was doing. And I think Bengals fans kind of hope that we have the same thing with Zampese, that he's figuring things out, and hopefully year 2 looks nothing like year 1 in a positive sense, not a negative one. So you kind of wonder, since they were a team that had just come off a playoff appearance, they were 11-3 in 75. It makes you kind of wonder, okay, if Walsh would have, and I think this is one thing that I think the answer is probably no. That if Walsh was there, had a few years where he wasn't doing as good as Paul Brown had done when Paul Brown stepped down to kind of the height. Okay, I've built this team up. We're a playoff team. Now I'm stepping back. If Walsh had taken over and didn't have the initial success like they did that first year in 76 and then those couple years Greg had, I think they probably would have let Walsh go and he would have been successful somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to correct myself, I said that Sam Wyche coached under Bill Walsh with the Bengals. That's not correct. I was half correct. He did coach under Bill Walsh, but it was with the 49ers as an assistant coach from 1979 to 1982. It wasn't with the Bengals. But like I said, he was a player pupil of Walsh with the Bengals during Walsh's time as the team's wide receivers coach, and then subsequently the quarterbacks coach with Wyche there. So I think from there, a lot of Bengals fans, even the newer, younger Bengals fans, kind of know a little bit as to what happened in the 80s. Walsh got 2 Super Bowl wins against the Bengals. Those 2, it was Super Bowl Super Bowl 17, Super Bowl 16 or 17, Super Bowl 16 and Super Bowl 23. After the 81 and the 88 seasons, and Walsh beat not only Forrest Gregg, but then he beat his former, kind of his apprentice. He beat Walsh in that Super Bowl. Both were known as very, very competitive, down to the wire Super Bowls, and obviously cemented Joe Montana's legacy as one of the greatest quarterbacks in the NFL history, and as kind of the comeback king, especially in that Super Bowl 23 there. So just some extra quotes before we get into the hypothetical. And again, this is courtesy of Jim Ozarski of the Cincinnati Enquirer. If you have not checked out this article, it's a pretty good historical read in terms of kind of how this whole thing played out. And he talks about Bill Walsh and his time, and unfortunately, Bill Walsh is no longer alive. He passed away a handful of years ago. But some really interesting quotes here, Scott. You look at Homer Rice that you mentioned was the former Bengals coach who kind of relieved Tiger Johnson after he resigned. He said, quote, Bill Walsh, of course, was a genius in offensive football. He had magic. Ken came there and was a spread-out quarterback. Ken Anderson came there and was a spread-out quarterback from a small school, never backed up in his life, and Bill took him from step 1 to step 7 and all the way through and trained him, and, of course, Ken became a great one himself. Then we talked about potentially the questionable decision between Tiger Johnson and Bill Walsh, and the fact that Brown went with a guy that was an actual coordinator and a guy that was kind of a little bit more of a known quantity to him. And here's a quote from Isaac Curtis, one of the Bengals' greatest receivers they've ever had. He said, quote, I probably thought that it would have been Bill Walsh to get the job, only because it's the progression. The offensive coordinator would be the next person to step up. Bengals receiver Isaac Curtis said, and so I think I was probably surprised, as a lot of people were. Bengals then tight end and future head coach Bruce Coslet says he, meaning Walsh, was, to say the least, he was upset. And Sam Weish agreed. Bill was very upset. Bill thought he was the guy that was ready to do it, and obviously he was. And that's a pretty telling statement from Weish, a guy that was defeated by Walsh in the Super Bowl. Coslet continued, the whole thing kind of hurt Bill. I mean, they were pretty tight because there was like 6 guys on the staff in those days, 3 on offense, 3 on defense, and Paul. From there, after Paul Brown made that decision, the relationship was strained. Let's put it that way. That's as diplomatic as I can be. So obviously there was some stuff brewing in that locker room once that decision was made. And then Eddie DeBartolo kind of had some interesting stuff to say as well. Let's see. He said he always felt as though he was passed by in Cincinnati, and he probably should have had the job that Tiger Johnson had. I don't think Bill ever got over that. That was something that bothered him for probably the rest of his life because he felt he gave his all to Cincinnati. Homer Rice continued. I think the relationship was so close. It was very painful for Bill to beat Bill Walsh to beat Sam Weish. But that's just part of the game. Bill was all about winning championships, but it hurt him also to have to defeat someone that was so close to him. But that's the reality of football. Okay, so now we get to – there's going to be a couple of hypothetical questions here, Scott. The obvious one is, would the Bengals have been the 49ers of the 80s? And granted, Sam Weish is one of the most well-respected, well-liked head coaches in the fans, in Bengals fans' eyes, and rightfully so. He was a character. He did a lot of successful things. The offense was awesome under him. But given what you said in terms of the parallels during those first handful of years of the split, when Walsh went his way and the Bengals went their other way, and then what transpired really when Walsh and Montana hit their stride and Weish hit his stride with the Bengals in the 80s. But would the Bengals, do you think, if it was as simple as Bill Walsh replacing Sam Wyche in that early to mid 80s period, do you think that the Bengals would have won as many or a championship or how many under Walsh instead of under Wyche?
Yeah, I think without a doubt, if you, for some reason, if let's say Paul Brown or Mike Brown, the Brown family would have said, hey, it's 1984, we're not hiring Sam Wyche. Somehow we're going to pluck Bill Walsh from the 49ers. I don't know if we're going to do a John Gruden thing, trade him a first-round pick or something, and we're going to just bury the hatchet. And somehow, in a world where they bring him in, I think without a doubt they would be better. And I think part of the reason why I think that's a very easy decision is, as much as the Bengals fans love Sam Wyche because he did get to a Super Bowl and he was a very strong personality. I mean, people loved him for the way he'd run up the score on the Houston Oilers. They loved him for his comment he said about, hey, you don't live in Cleveland. Those kind of things when you had those big rivalries in the division. I think that still resonates with fans. They really like him for it. They're very memorable. He had that great run in '88. That being said, and he only ever had three winning seasons in his 12-year head coaching career. That also includes his last few years in Tampa, which just kind of shows how far a Super Bowl gets you. One Super Bowl appearance basically, erases the fact that, okay, he had a career losing record, 84 and 107 for his career. Only 2 appearances in the playoffs, only three winning records in 12 seasons. But that kind of gets overlooked because he did make that one Super Bowl. So you take that one Super Bowl out and you kind of look at what Sam Wyche had done, the body of work that he has, and the body of work that Sam. Sorry, my mind's going crazy. The body of work that Bill Walsh had, Walsh and Wyche.
It's a tongue twister. It's a tongue twister for sure. Yeah.
And no comparison in the 80s that Bill Walsh would have been a better option. Just like how you could argue there would have been better options for music in the 80s than 80s music. But that's another discussion. Some people disagree with that too. But that being said, I think that without a doubt, Walsh would have been the better choice.
Okay.
If that was feasible to you.
And interesting comment from Michael Myers in the chat room. He disagrees with the notion that the Bengals would have had the same degree of success as the 49ers did under Walsh. He said, I say no because the Browns wouldn't have spent the money the Niners did when there was no cap rule. The Brown family is kind of what he meant. He said the 49ers were the reason the NFL brought in the cap rule, or part of the reason, I should say. Agreed there. I just look at it. It's a hypothetical, so it's so hard to say. I would think a guy who won 3 Super Bowls in the span of a decade, essentially, I would think that he would have been able to recreate some of that same championship style of success in Cincinnati, especially when you look his offensive mind and the offensive players that the Bengals had at that time, especially towards the late 80s. You would think that he would bring some of that, but I don't know that we're talking 3 championships with the Bengals. There's so many interesting things to me with the Sam Wyche Bengals and the Bill Walsh 49ers. And you look at it and you say, okay, you get a guy who is either somewhat mobile, whether it's Ken Anderson. Boomer wasn't as mobile as Ken Anderson, but could move a little bit and was the master of the play action fake. You get a receiving running back. The 49ers had Roger Craig, and the Bengals had James Brooks. You get the Bengals had the best offensive tackle that has ever suited up in Anthony Munoz. They had a Pro Bowl guard and Max Montoya. So they had a lot of pieces, and a lot of what Sam Wyche implemented especially with Boomer Esiason, was stuff that was West Coast style that Bill Walsh kind of was the innovator of in San Francisco. So there's a lot of stuff there. Now, the other hypothetical, not so much, I guess it would be as akin to winning championships, but there's a lot of things, and Homer Rice in these quotes from the Cincinnati Enquirer said so, but obviously Walsh made a lot of good steps with Ken Anderson, and Walsh did a lot of good things with Boomer Esiason. Do you think that the career path, Scott, would have been different for Montana and Boomer if Walsh was the coach of the Bengals, or did Walsh get what was probably the best possible out of Boomer in the 1980s, especially in that MVP season of '88?
It's obviously impossible to tell, in hindsight going back. I would have to assume that you would think with a offensive mind like Walsh, you would have gotten more from the Bengals offense just because of who he was. That being said, you kind of have to wonder, okay, if Boomer wasn't exactly the kind of quarterback that Walsh would have wanted, would they have even drafted Boomer? And then that gets into other questions, and you would kind of assume, when he was drafted, it was because he had fallen so far. I think he fell to the second round when he was expected to be a first-round quarterback. And so if he was there when the Bengals were drafting with Walsh, you might argue, well, okay, they would have taken him anyway because he'd have been the best player. But if they were set on, no, we want a guy who's more of a, West Coast, guy who can move a little bit, who can, has the high accuracy dink and dunk, but isn't necessarily a great deep ball guy. They may have gone a totally different direction at quarterback, and you never really know. But I would have to assume that, yeah, just based on the results, how the offenses looked with the players that were in there, I think you kind of would have to argue that Walsh would have been a better offensive producer. You would have gotten more from the offense from Walsh without having any way of actually proving it.
Which is saying quite a bit, because especially in that '88 season, and even into I believe it was 1990, the Bengals offense was really clicking well. Obviously, James Brooks, Ickey Woods, there's Tim McGee, Rodney Holman. A lot of very good players, a lot of Pro Bowl players, aside from some of the others that I mentioned, that are some parallels between those Niners teams and those Bengals teams in the '80s. Scott, is this – so when I look at it, again, this isn't really a hypothetical like some of the other questions we had, but I guess what I see is, once again, the Brown family trait of favoritism, and this shone through with the Bengals going with Tiger Johnson instead of Bill Walsh. Tiger Johnson was there at the inception of the Bengals franchise as an offense, I believe, as offensive line coach with the team in 1968. Was with the team for a number of years before he got promoted to head coach. Obviously, Walsh was as well, but it was kind of the Paul Brown, old school conservative mindset. We want a guy who has been around the block quite a bit and maybe won some championships, and we can't trust these newbies and these guys that kind of have a little bit of a wackier approach. Obviously, they changed their mind a little bit when it came to Walsh, but that again was an internal hire of sorts, because Walsh was intimately familiar with the Brown family and the Bengals. So I don't want to say that it was maybe a culture type of hire or Passover of Walsh, but I look at it and it's hard to dispute that. I don't know. We see some of the same things from Mike Brown in terms of who gets hired. Now, obviously, people can argue that things are changing today, but it's obvious he stuck with Marvin Lewis, a guy he trusts, even though he was an outside guy. It's a guy he trusts and has trusted for a long time, and he's promoted other guys within the organization, or hung on to other guys that are kind of Bengals guys, if you will. Is this simply just something that all of us need to kind of accept as Bengals fans, those of us who follow the organization? Is this just kind of an early chapter of the favoritism and the mindset of the Brown family of let's go conservative, let's go with the devil we know and maybe not the one we don't, and sometimes it bites them in the rear end?
Yeah, and I think you see this with, I mean, there have been many times where they made decisions that kind of made you wonder if that was, there's something obviously more than just what you see on paper or just what seems kind of like the obvious thing. And you can look back when they hired Dave Shula. I mean, that was a big one. He had, had the lineage. He had the family name. His dad had won a Super Bowl, had a really good career. So they bring him in because of that, not of anything he had ever done. But, kind of the old school, old football mentality, he's a, NFL family. And when they do that, the guy who they supposedly had interviewed but passed on was Bill Cowher. And, of course, we all know how Bill Cowher did versus Dave Shula in their NFL careers. So you could argue there was another one, passing on Walsh or Johnson and then hiring Dave Shula and passing on Cowher. And, I mean, you see it today, too, with, like, some of the players. And it's interesting how Marvin Lewis, even though he was not part of that at all, he has kind of that similar mentality, and he kind of gets knocked on it for favoring the veterans and the guys who practice right, we're going to start, Robert Gathers over Dunlap, even though the Gathers can't, pressure anyone, and Dunlap is in the backfield all the time, even though we never let him play. And, they did that with, okay, Antoine Odom, we're just going to keep him out there forever, and we're going to keep Ray Maluga out there forever, even though he runs maybe just a tick faster than I do, which isn't saying very much. And so you just kind of, and it's decisions that he makes because, well, that's kind of my guy. And it just seems to be a Bengal thing. I'm sure it's not just a thing the Bengals do. I'm sure other teams have done it too. But with the Bengals, especially with the head coaches, when you see the guys they passed on and the guys they kept, that huge disparity between success, it kind of makes you cringe knowing what possibly could have been. Of course, that's assuming they would have kept the guy and made the hiring choice and kept the guy long enough for him to have the success that he had elsewhere. But, it is interesting to ponder. And since we have months until camp, we have to ponder something.
Yeah, and again, that's the thing with hypotheticals. You look back in the rear view and you go, okay, what could have happened? And that should be on the Bengals team crest or the Brown family crest. What could have happened? And I love that you bring up Cowher. I love that you bring up other guys that were passed over, because that's kind of the crux of these hypothetical questions, which is basically, does the Brown family provide a culture and an atmosphere for guys that, could have been easily a head coach for the team? Do they provide the culture that these other teams or other owners provide those guys that they've passed up that ended up having success? Do they still provide that culture that would allow these guys to be as successful potentially in Cincinnati as more so than a Walsh, more so than a Marvin Lewis? And, that's kind of the question of the ages. Now, I think, as I mentioned just a minute ago, we think that things have changed in terms of internal practices and how the front office trusts Marvin Lewis and how they operate, as opposed to what they did 20, 30 years ago. You just have to wonder. A guy like Walsh was in Cincinnati's doors. I mean, he was with them for years, and they don't take him. And not only does he win 3 Super Bowls, he wins 2 of them at the hands of the Bengals. So you just kind of look at it and you go, well, I mean, you have to hope it's either a long span of bad luck that's going to run out at some point, and the Bengals will finally, get on a streak of some good luck, or they need to, once again, reassess the practices and how they build a team, how they approach everything, and really get to become a team like the 1980 49ers, the 1980s 49ers, the Steelers of not only the 70s, but of recent years as well. I think that's just kind of the core of this entire history lesson, if you will, is kind of just how the Bengals operate, and if they are giving their coaches everything they need to be able to create a championship team. And again, it's kind of, I don't know. I mean, from the outside, you see it and you go, well, probably not. But I don't know. Any additional thoughts, Scott?
just think one thing you mentioned, that culture, and I think Mike Brown would like to win. I mean, you would hope that if you own an NFL team, you would like to win. But I think there's different levels of that, and I think that's what you're hitting on is you get someone like Mike Brown. I'm sure, yeah, all things being equal, I'd like to win. I don't want to lose money in this venture because this is my business, my livelihood, and it'd be nice to win. I'd prefer to. I'm trying to win. But then you look at someone, and this is a great outsider's view, but someone like Jerry Jones, who comes across to me as someone that not only would I like to win, it is my life to win. Everything I do is going to win. I don't care what I have to do. I'm going to do everything in my power to try to get this team to win. And granted, sometimes it leads to meddling, and that can hurt the team. But, at the end of the day, that he's going to do everything he physically can to see that his team wins, whereas Mike Brown's more the kind of like, let's say you're into politics, and I don't know, you're in California. California's a blue state. So say you had a neighbor who wanted Hillary Clinton to win. Mike Brown's the guy who'd be like, I'll go to the poll and I'll cast my vote because I like to see her win. Someone like a Jerry Jones is like, not only do I want to see her win, I'm going to do everything I can to put her in there. I'm going to go to the poll, chase people away who are going to vote for Trump. I'm going to go door to door and hand out flyers and pamphlets and I'm going to bus people to the polling place. There's a different level of what you're going to do to see your person win. And I think Mike Brown's more the passive. Yeah, I'd like to see that, but it's not. I'm not going to kill myself doing it. And so to me, it seems to be the difference is how far. I mean, obviously, Mike Brown doesn't want to see the team lose, and people grumble, "Oh, he's just interested in money. He doesn't care if they win or lose." I would say that's probably not entirely accurate. I'm sure he wants to win. I mean, you don't own a business with the intent of not having a good product. I mean, you don't sit there and think, if you have like a generic TV company thinking, as long as we make a profit, I really don't care if our TVs are all crap and break within a year. Who cares? Someone will buy them. I mean, you obviously are trying to make something halfway decent. It may not be, if you're making when Yugo is making cars, they weren't trying to be as good as Honda or Toyota. They weren't trying to make a Honda Accord that lasts for, 30, 40 years. But they weren't trying to make something that broke within the first week. They just and I'm sorry, it's kind of off topic, I guess.
No, it's totally on topic. And that's what it comes. And I think you're right. And I think what you're saying is, obviously his father was a godfather on the Mount Rushmore of NFL football and was a guy who won a number of championships. Granted, this was in the 30s, 40s, 50s, a long time ago. But was a very successful coach, implemented a number of awesome things that we see in today's football. That's another history lesson for another time. But Mike Brown, he's got that gene in him undoubtedly of, hey, I want to win. I want to win championships. I've seen my dad win, and I've seen what happens to him when he loses. I feel the same way. So that's not I think that's where some fans get a little, oh, Mike Brown doesn't really care. He just wants to make a buck. Well, yeah, he wants to make a profit, but he does want to win. The problem is how, and even the great Paul Brown had the same flaw, and Mike Brown has definitely shown it, is that their way is the way. And unfortunately, I keep talking about this conservative nature. We talk about how the team doesn't move up often in the draft for a potential game-changing player because they want to save draft picks. We talk about how they're kind of frugal in free agency and kind of prefer to extend their own guys, which when you extend your own guys, that's a great thing, especially when they're productive, but you got to supplement that with some other free agency moves. And that's just not how both of those guys have operated. And that's kind of, I don't want to say those are the reasons as to why we haven't seen the Bengals win a championship. But when you look at some of those, when you look at that and things haven't really changed, obviously you kind of sit there and look at it and go, okay, well, that's kind of how they operate. They think they're right. And you got to hope that at some point that strategy pays off, but it hasn't. One little interesting hypothetical that we saw, or that I saw in the YouTube chat, was again from Michael Myers, who said, he just kind of mentioned the Browns, and we can sit here and say the Sam Weish, Bill Walsh discussion, but obviously what if the Browns didn't move and kind of stuck with Bill Belichick, who had struggled for his first couple of years, had a decent season. His last, I believe it was his last year there, or second to last year there. What if they had stuck with Bill Belichick and let him build what he built in New England? And we might be seeing a very different franchise there. But that's our history lesson for this week's episode. What do you think? We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your thoughts, especially from some of those old school fans who remember those days of Bill Walsh and Sam Weish, Ken Anderson, Boomer Esiason, and you know, if we left any details out, let us know. You know, we are definitely a little longer in the tooth than some Bengals fans, but we did not experience the inception of this franchise in the 1970s, that sort of thing. So if you have some additional thoughts, let us know. You can hit us up on Twitter at BengalsOBI, via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. You can also, if you want to comment, and we've received quite a few, both on YouTube and other areas, YouTube, iTunes, you can download all the stuff there, SoundCloud as well, Cincy Jungle. If you want to leave some extra comments there, we like to read those and on the air, and/or we just like to absorb them and appreciate the feedback that we get from you. So let us know what you think about this history lesson. And props again to Jim Ozarski of the Cincinnati Enquirer for putting together this little piece over the holiday, the July 4th holiday. It was pretty interesting with a lot of good quotes. So if you haven't checked that out yet, please do. It's pretty awesome. We are going to get to listener questions. And before we do, Scott, I wanted to rehash a comment we received from last week's segment about, you know, we talked about Marvin Lewis's possible replacements. We don't need to go through the whole thing again, but we did get one from PMore8230 on YouTube. And he or she had written, I think there's little doubt it'll be an in-house promotion if Lewis leaves. Most likely Paul Gunther, but if it's got to be in-house, I hope like crazy it's James Urban. Based on everything I've read about Urban, it seems like he quote-unquote gets it and has the right mind to be a head coach. Just any additional thoughts on Urban? We didn't really talk about him much last week.
Yeah, we really haven't. I can't say I've read too much about him. I can't really say one way or the other. I know he doesn't have the outside hype that someone like Vance Joseph did, who is also a positional guy, unlike a Mike Zimmer or Gruden, who were hired, or even Hugh Jackson, who were hired from the offensive and defensive coordinator ranks. So it would be interesting to see them bring up a guy like that from the positional, because that's kind of what, you know, Bill Walsh was. He was a positional guy who they passed on, and they generally go with a guy who has head coaching experience elsewhere or is a coordinator. So, yeah, it would be an interesting hire to see them go that route, because that wouldn't really be commended for what they do. But that being said, I can't say I've read too much on Urban to say one way or the other if he would be the right guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's done a pretty admirable job with the Bengals receiving core at this point. And, you know, again, it's kind of hard for – I mean, if we're talking – directly, if Lewis and the Bengals struggle this next year, and you know, if they struggle and they're looking at in-house candidates, it's kind of hard, especially based on what we talked about with position coaches and all of that. You know, maybe it's a little difficult for a position coach just to jump into a head coaching role. It's happened before around the NFL. I do think there's probably some other guys that, again, based on the favoritism, whether it's Paul Alexander, whether it's Paul Gunther, some of these guys they've had for a little while longer, and they seem to trust a bit more. But Urban has done a lot of things. Obviously, A.J. Green continues to play very well. Brandon LaFell had a great year stepping in. Well, I shouldn't say great, but a solid year stepping in for Green in injury. Tyler Boyd showed some nice things, and then obviously – you know, a lot of different things there. So, you know, good thought. I definitely see the value of Urban. I think a lot of people do, but we'll see if that's the route the Bengals take. Should Lewis be let go or not re-signed after this year? Good comment though from P Moore there. We did get an email as well, and this one, it's talks about the Bengals defense, Scott. And it says, I hear a lot about the Bengals defense, and most of it centers on the corners, the new defensive ends, Willis, Lawson, Gunther, and Billings return. I think we need to really be talking about Shawn Williams. In his first year as a full starter, we should have enough to look at to decide what we have there. What do we have with Williams? Do we have just a guy who is a hard hitter and can get to the play with authority, or do we have a guy who could play in the Bengals defense where both safeties have to play center field? Can he cover deep when strong NFL quarterbacks, many of whom are in the AFC North, extend plays and chuck the ball downfield? So kind of some general thoughts on Shawn Williams from you. He's kind of been a little bit up and down. He was kind of a spot duty guy when Reggie Nelson was with the team, and has since he played pretty well towards the end of the year last year. But your overall thoughts is he did receive a contract extension last offseason. So is he a long-term answer opposite of George Aloka in your opinion?
Yeah, I think when looking at his first year or two when he was a backup, he kind of reminded me of a Taylor Mays or Jabril Peppers, just without the hype. One of these guys who's an inside-the-box safety, not a great coverage guy, but a guy who's best playing close to the line of scrimmage, playing in run support, who can cover if you have to, but is more of a liability. So I wasn't too excited when they extended him, just based on what I'd seen. And then early in the year, as you mentioned, he really seemed to struggle last year, starting the year as far as coverage, as far as not being able to cover guys either by blown assignments or by technique or whatever it was. He just wasn't getting the job done as a defensive secondary player, doing more than just stopping the run. That being said, I was pretty much ready to write him off because, years of the backup, haven't seen much. Beginning of the year as a starter, haven't seen much. But at the end of the year, he looked very, very different. He looked like a guy who was not a liability anymore. I'm like, wow, okay, this guy's making some plays back there. And I'd say I was pleasantly impressed. I mean, I'm not saying he's a Hall of Famer. I'm not saying he's a Pro Bowler, but definitely looked by the end of the year, and it's amazing what a full year of playing time can do for some guys, and kind of turn him around, get him that experience, get him enough of what he needed to look like a good player. And one of the things I'm very hesitant, though, is because beginning last year, the one thing everyone was saying was that the Bengals had a very tough start to the season and a very weak end of the season as far as schedule strength. And so some of the players who look good at the end of the year, I'm very hesitant to say they turned the corner, only because we were playing some, on average, some worse teams to end the year. So it's really hard to say. I mean, he did look better. I'm not ready to say it's because all of a sudden it clicked and he is a great safety, but I don't want to say it's only because of the competition was worse. But that being said, he looks like a guy who is going to be a decent NFL starter, someone that you can put out there that you're not going to cringe when you see him on the field, who's not going to be someone who's a major liability in the defensive secondary, someone that you can put in he's a decent, like a Ndukwe kind of a guy. Yeah, he's maybe a little better than him. Someone that, okay, he's a starter. He's a guy who can play run defense. He can cover, if you need to, but he's not going to be a great player. And when they drafted him, I think anyone thought, okay, this is going to be a great player, or, Eric Berry or Eric Thomas, or, one of those, Troy Polamalu. You're hoping you get a guy who can start. And I think he's, that's what he can be. Although the thing I will say I did like about when we had Reggie Nelson was, I think Reggie Nelson was a very good free safety, a much better coverage guy than we have now, which meant Aloka was able to do more of the run support. Well, now you have Williams. Between him and Aloka, I think Aloka's probably a better coverage guy, but I don't think he's as good of a coverage guy as you have had in Nelson. So I think we are, with the two of them, we have two guys who I think can do a decent job up close, but we don't have that true, Ed, granted, as I say, Ed Reed, but obviously no one has an Ed Reed except, but someone like that. No one's going to look at these guys and say, wow, they have that great, rangy, deep, kind of like in the draft this year they were talking about with Malik Hooker. He's, had that upside. People were comparing him to Ed Reed. That's the one thing you don't have with either of these two guys. At least it doesn't seem to. But that being said, they're not bad. I think they can get the job done. especially if the guys up front are as good as people are saying they are, so they don't have to be in coverage, for an eternity. And obviously, the best friend of a defensive back is a good pass rush.
Yeah.
And so if the pass rush does what it's supposed to, then it really won't matter as long as they're not horrible. They're going to be I think they can be good enough.
One thing I like about Shawn Williams that I've seen since he's been with the Bengals, you hit the nail on the head in terms of his knock was coming out of college, out of Georgia, was great hitter, great run stopper. He literally had to learn more of the pass coverage nuances under Mike Zimmer and Paul Gunther as his defensive coordinator in the NFL. He really didn't do much in pass coverage. He was more of an in-the-box safety that helped out against the run. And what I've seen is improvement. And I've seen improvement. Now, again, I don't know if we're talking about a Pro Bowler. I don't know if we're talking about a guy that will be better than George Aloka. I don't really know if I see that, but I see a guy who has improved in his time here. And I believe it was 2015 when he stepped in a couple times for Reggie Nelson, and he made a incredible interception against the Steelers to seal that tough win that year. Just a guy who has improved. I, like you, was wary of the contract they gave him. Granted, it is a bit team friendly, even though he can make a decent amount of money. I see improvement, and I like that. And for those of you who like Pro Football Focus, and this article is on CincyJungle.com, Shawn Williams was noted by Pro Football Focus as their secret superstar. He played in almost 90% of the snaps last year, which was equivalent to 912, which is pretty crazy. But he's doing his thing against the run. We've seen him make some hard hits to cause some incompletions in the passing game. I like it. He's a little bit of an enforcer. I just see improvement. I don't see a superstar. I don't see a great safety on the horizon, but I see a guy who is steadily improving and doing things better. I didn't like what I saw from the pass defense as a whole at the beginning of the year, especially in that Denver Broncos game. That was atrocious, but he was a guy that like I said, towards the end of the year, improved, even though the schedule got a little weaker towards the end of the year. We've got a couple more here, Scott, before we get out of here. I believe it was Greg in the YouTube chat who said, with it, just kind of going along the lines of a crowded secondary. Crowded secondary this year, obviously, at safety and especially at cornerback. Who could be the odd man out, whether it's a surprise or not?
That is a good question. I mean, it's obviously not going to be Kirkpatrick. I mean, the easy answer would say, someone could say Adam Jones if we think they're ever going to cut the guy. If they don't cut him, then you figure, okay, it's not going to be Kirkpatrick. I don't think they're going to cut Denard because they just signed him to the option. Actually, I'm just saying this because I'm trying to think who's even in the secondary. Not Iloka, not Williams just talked about. They seem to like Fedulum. I think when they drafted him, a lot of people were kind of hesitant to think he'd be more of a special teams guy, but at least everything they've said is that they like him as a guy who can be a backup safety. But of course, I like all these people. I don't know if it's Josh Shaw, Kavari Russell. I think all those guys, there's a lot of guys who are on the fence, but they're all pretty – as of right now, I guess I don't know. I'd have to look at the roster and try to wrap my head around who's there. If they're going to keep 8 or 9, who would be that guy? So as of right now, I'm going to pass it to you.
Okay, I'm going to say, and I've said it a couple times on some Cincy Jungle mailbag posts that I do on that site. I've said it a couple times now over the past couple of months, and mine's Darren Smith. I really like the guy. I think he was a guy that I thought, and our friend Joe Goodberry, who's been on this program before, was very high on Darren Smith when the Bengals drafted him. He was a guy that probably should have gone at least a round or two higher than when the Bengals drafted him. But he hasn't shown the same, like he's been a fill-in guy a couple of times. He hasn't shown the same type of ability to make a play like a Shawn Williams had at safety. Obviously a very different player, not the same build as Shawn Williams, but still, I specifically remember being in person at that Broncos game, and Darren Smith had a couple of Not great plays that day, as did basically anyone in that secondary. But, you mentioned they like Clayton Fedulum. They drafted Brandon Wilson this year, who's a guy that can he played corner, he played safety, he returned kicks at Houston. That's a guy I think that could maybe push a guy like Darren Smith off of the roster. And Brandon Wilson was a guy that the Bengals made that rare move up to get. They traded up to get him because they really liked him. So I like Darren Smith. I'd like to see a way that they can keep like a lot of these guys, if not all of them. But there just might be a couple of names like that is unfortunate that they don't make the team. So that's a guy I see. Let's go with one more here, Scott. I believe it was from Evan in the chat room, Evan Hill. Does Willie Anderson or Andrew Whitworth end up making the Hall of Fame? I'm going to say no. I think both are deserving in many respects. I think the lack of success of the Bengals in terms of championships and the fact that they are not a huge market team kind of limits their spotlight in terms of national media. And I think also what hurt Andrew Whitworth specifically was the fact that he played in a division with Joe Thomas, another excellent tackle, but a guy that was drafted high. Jonathan Ogden, I think, was at the tail end of his career when Whitworth was there, another guy that was drafted very high. So he just got overshadowed in the division, even though he played very well. I say no. Willie Anderson probably has a better shot than Whitworth does. I just think they're both in the eyes of voters and all of that. I think they're probably in that quote unquote hall of very good, maybe even like Ken Anderson. What do you think?
Yeah, I just had to look up Anderson because I think he's been I know I'm not using the right term, a quarterfinalist. I know he hasn't made the final cut, the one right before they get in. We did a write-up on that a few months ago. I forget the exact terminology when they make like the finals and the semifinals. As far as the players who are being elected to the Hall of Fame, he's always been on that initial list and never gotten all the way down to where he's one of the final guys being voted on. So at least he's getting some recognition, but it doesn't seem to be getting any better. And obviously, the farther away you get from your career, the easier it is for people to forget about you or people who remember you to retire and new people. Someone like Connor, who was on our, once he's working in the sports media, he's a young kid. He was probably born after Willie Anderson retired.
Yeah.
And I'm just, nothing to get. I'm just saying it because the younger generation doesn't know the older players as well. So your chances obviously get less and less. That being said, I think he deserves it. He has 4 Pro Bowls, 3 first-team All-Pro selections, and it should be higher. The only reason he has that few is because that kind of coincides with when the Bengals got halfway decent. His first Pro Bowl was in 2003, which was, I think, Lewis's first year. And before that, the team was atrocious. But yet he was still, keeping the quarterback upright. He was, the lead blocker, helping Corey Dillon get those huge, career days and, tons of yardage. And you think, okay, on a team that horrible, how is Dillon getting all this yardage? Great, Dillon was good, but it helped to have someone that good in front of him. I would love to see him get in. I think he deserves to be in. I don't know if there's an outside chance that some way they can get him in. But I think he has a better chance than Whitworth, just because Whitworth was overlooked for so many years, even for Pro Bowl selections. Whitworth was always a guy who, by Pro Football Focus, and everyone's like, this is a great player, went that whole year, didn't give him a single sack, and still wasn't All-Pro. And there was just nothing he could do to get the recognition he deserved. And Leon Hall was a guy who was like that before he had all his injuries, who was a very good corner that has never got his recognition. And because the team wasn't winning and it's a small market, I think at the end of the day, neither probably gets in. Willie has a better chance, is probably more deserving. But Ken Anderson's probably more deserving too. And if he can't get in, then it just makes you wonder who can get in unless you're without that Super Bowl.
Yep. And Willie Anderson, to your point, Willie Anderson played, I believe he was drafted in, was it 96? So he played his first 7 seasons on Bengals teams that were largely pretty terrible, and didn't get the recognition that he deserved. And unfortunately, for those who love Pro Football Focus and respect what they do, a lot of those metrics in terms of what was available then were not talked about during the early parts of Willie Anderson's career. Obviously, he was a major factor, not only in the games that they did win and in the first 7 years of his career as a Bengal, but obviously the big ones they won in the early part of the Marvin Lewis era. Very good player, vastly underrated. I think obviously if he played for another team that was more successful, especially early in his career, he would probably get more mention to this. And that's what irks me about the whole Pro Bowl process, the Hall of Fame voting process. Unfortunately, some of the voters and whatnot are guys that, they really follow the big names. They follow the teams that win the championships, and they don't really dig into the weeds in terms of some of these guys that are good players that maybe haven't been on high profile teams, winning teams. And I think Willie Anderson, unfortunately, was a guy that was part of that, and it falls into that. And I don't think he'll make it in the Hall of Fame. Good question though. And I think hopefully, especially as some of these voters do get younger and do look at some of these analytics like Pro Football Focus, Football Outsiders, that sort of thing, as they look at some of those analytics, that's going to help some of these guys that maybe were on poor teams, but they just continue to play very good football. Maybe that gets talked about more in the years to come in terms of voting guys into the Hall of Fame, because there are guys out there that probably deserve to be in the Hall of Fame that aren't because of just a lack of interest or a lack of knowledge of the player and the team that they played for. So shame for those two. Probably deserving, probably won't get in. Do you have another thought, Scott?
I mean, that reminds me a lot of baseball, because you see that a lot in baseball. The guys who win the Gold Glove Award are generally guys who had good offensive numbers, which has nothing to do with how they play on defense, but they kind of know the name. And since you have the Anaheim Angels hat on, I'll mention the LA Dodgers closer, Kenny Jansen, recently complained that some Dodgers didn't get in because the fans didn't vote, didn't stack the ballots enough in their favor, which I think is, a very absurd thing to say. And it just kind of points out the, kind of silliness of how some of those things are selected, because it's all popularity. There was one year, years ago, Jose Canseco made the All-Star game. He was hurt and only played like one game or two games that whole season, but it was based on his name. And I think you get a lot of that with these awards. If the guy, he won it last year, we'll give it to me, he's a decent player. And it's really hard to, and not that Pro Football Focus is the best metric, but it's a metric. It's a step in the right direction, kind of like baseball has, but, the WAR and everything else, all these additional things to try to figure out, okay, how much all these things really play in, their defense, their speed, they're getting picked off, they're getting on base, and kind of that, you see that with football. And to your point, I totally agree. If they had something like that 10, 20, 30 years ago, if you could retroactively apply that, someone like Willie Anderson clearly deserves in, because, and some of the guys who are in, you'd kind of cringe thinking, oh my gosh, how did we let him in? But he was a big name. People knew him for whatever reason. His team was good. And he just kind of rode the coattails of that into all the awards. And so, yeah, it's a very subjective thing. It is kind of cool that the metrics are taking some of that out of the picture, which that's kind of funny when you hear someone like Marvin Lewis say, oh, yeah, that's a bunch of crap. I just, we're going to kind of be old school, because obviously, if you just kind of hang on to those old ways and ignore that modern technology. Yeah, I'm just going to march into the battle in a like Civil War. Straight lines with musket balls. We'll go charge up against those guys with machine guns. We'll be fine. We don't need that modern junk.
And I also think too that the criteria that voters would use for Hall of Fame voting would be. It's especially when, obviously Pro Bowls, you look at a guy, he had 10 Pro Bowls in 12 years. And, in the 80s and 90s, that usually meant quite a bit. And those were a bit more deserving. Now you look at guys that make a Pro Bowl that maybe don't have a Pro Bowl to their name because they either back out or because they don't want to play in the game anymore and all of that. That's going to really muddy waters, I think, down the road for Hall of Fame voting. And it's going to be interesting to see, maybe a guy only has 3 Pro Bowls to his name in 10 years of playing, but he was a guy that should have made 7 or 8 Pro Bowls and he gets in, and vice versa. So I think that's going to be interesting, because players are now kind of standing up for themselves in terms of the league's all-star game and not playing. And, there's the fifth alternate is a guy who starts sometimes for Pro Bowl teams, and that just that's going to really make things interesting for voters as some of these guys retire.
Yeah, and there's a reason they don't let fans, draft the NFL. And same reason, like, we'll let them vote for the All-Stars or whatever, and even, like, the sports writer fans vote for the Hall of Fame. So we're not going to let them. And it just reminds me, just really quick, it's kind of related. Shawn Williams, when they drafted him, the guy out of Georgia, the safety that everyone wanted on Cincy Jungle and, kind of all their draft sites, the top Georgia safety was Bakari Rambo.
Yep.
And when the Bengals went the third round with Shawn Williams, when Bakari Rambo was out there.
Yep.
Oh,
I remember.
Everyone's like, what is wrong with this team? Like, he's not a coverage guy. We need a guy who can cover. We need safety, defensive back. This team, like, they have no clue what they're doing. You go 4 years later, Shawn Williams is now a starter, had a solid, decent, Bakari Rambo is now on his third team, kind of bounced around as a backup. So it looks like they made the right choice. And as much as, sometimes we look in hindsight and the fans were right, they're not always right, not often as right as they think they are.
Yep, and it's also about, another conversation for another time, but it's also about, fans that watch college football, watch pro football, and they see a star player and a guy that, hey, there is a missing need on this team for a guy like that, but maybe that person in general just does not fit the scheme that the team employs. And that's probably the case with the Williams-Rambo debate. I definitely remember Bakari Rambo and was a bit in that camp of why is he not the guy? But
yeah. Mel Kiper has been mentioning it for months. I've never heard Mel Kiper say Shawn Williams. Obviously, the Bengals got it wrong.
Yep, and that was that's a great example of a guy that, going back to our first listener question this week, a great example of where the Bengals got that probably right. Probably right there. Thanks for all the questions this week, folks. We got them from a number of different routes. Again, we got them. We got one via email. You can send those theobinsider@gmail.com. We got one as a comment/question on YouTube. We got them in the YouTube chat. So send those there. If you have not subscribed to the Orange and Black Insider, either the channel on SoundCloud, the iTunes subscription, or our YouTube channel, please do so, especially if you like what we're doing and want to talk Bengals, want to hear about Bengals. We love to interact with you. We appreciate all of the feedback, all of the questions that you would have given us. Scott, I hope you had a fun 4th, my friend.
Yeah, it was good, and I'm looking forward to meeting next week so I can tell you how good my 13th was, or 11th, or whatever.
That's right. We may have another history lesson or two on the horizon for those who liked our little trip down memory lane, and for those who didn't. But we may have another one or two of those as training camp nears, but we are getting oh so close to that. We want to talk old school Bengals. We want to talk this year's Bengals squad, obviously. We want to talk all things Bengals on this show, and we appreciate the things that you listeners have sent our way. Just a couple of little side notes before we sign off. There's a couple of listeners and or people who tune into the show that talk about, when will this show be available on Google Play? When will this show have a potential call-in number so we're not just reading texts or emails and whatnot? Granted, keep sending them regardless if we have a phone number, but we're working on that, and once we do, we will get that to you, and we will make that available to you to call in and or get the show in a variety of different ways. So just keep your eyes and ears open for that. We'll let you know as that develops. Those requests for that have not gone unnoticed, and we wanted to let you know that. This has been the Orange and Black Insider. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks to my co-host, Scott Schulte. We'll see you next time. Hope you all had a great holiday, and we'll see you next episode.